Victims of home invasion. What happened? 1. This incident happened about 5 years ago. This is a story that I never really tell anymore, because most people are either uncomfortable hearing it or make well-meaning comments about what I should have done in this situation, without really understanding how differently your mind works when you're experiencing absolute panic. But you guys seem to get it, so here's my story. I was living in a relatively nice apartment in downtown Memphis working as an ophthalmic technician. I arrived home from work at my usual time, around 4:30 p.m., unlocked my door, and went inside. I set my phone, wallet, and keys on the kitchen island, hearing my heavy metal front door swing shut loudly behind me, and began taking care of some errands around the house. Having grown up in a small town, it was habit for me to not lock my door during the day, especially when I knew my husband would be home soon anyway. I've never forgotten to lock my door once in the 5 years since this day. I walked through my bathroom and into my large walk-in closet and began hanging up the laundry that I'd started earlier in the day before work. My front door opened, and I smiled with surprise. My husband was home a little early, and I was happily called out to him. "I'm in here, love." I was met with silence, and slowly began to feel that sinking feeling of something is wrong crawl up my spine. I tried to shake it off, thinking my husband simply hadn't heard me, and walked out into my living room/kitchen area. Standing on the other side of my kitchen island was a complete stranger. He was male, older than me. I would estimate 50s, but it's hard for me to recall exact facial features or details from this moment, and was just standing there, staring at me. No ski mask, no weapon, just watching me. I wondered if he'd maybe walked into the wrong apartment and was going to apologize and leave. But as he continued to stare, I realized I needed to do something other than just gape at this stranger in my house. I stood taller, puffed up my chest in an attempt to look more threatening, which is hard to do as a small female, and used a loud, clear voice, telling him to get out of my apartment, that he had no business being here. He completely ignored me, like I hadn't spoken. Then he began to pick up my things. My cell phone, my keys, my wallet. He picked them up methodically and put them into his own pockets. That's when it truly hit me that this person was dangerous. I was naive enough to believe this was all a mistake until that moment. I darted forward toward the only other device I had that would allow me to get help, my computer. I had to take a few steps closer to the intruder in order to reach it, but still had about 12 to 15 feet between us, so I knew I could grab it and run before he could reach me. As I picked it up and turned to run, I saw him start to move after me, and I sprinted back toward the bathroom, because it was the only place I could go, and put 2 locked doors between us, my bathroom door and the closest door. I slammed and locked the first door, and within seconds I could hear him messing with it, trying to open it. I ran into the closet and locked that door too, opening my computer and getting on Facebook Messenger to contact my husband. I sent message after message, pleading with him to call 911 and tell them there was an intruder in the apartment. He got the messages within minutes and assured me that he had a dispatcher on the phone and was leaving work himself to try and get to me if he could. I waited and waited. The bathroom door opened and the intruder came inside. He moved to the closet door and started trying to break that door down too. Here's the part where people usually start giving me advice on how I should have acted, but all I can tell you is that I was frozen. With fear, with shock, I don't know. But I didn't scream or cry or search for a weapon in that dark closet. I didn't brace the door or try to hold it closed. I just kneeled in my closet and waited to die, because I just knew that's what was going to happen. People like to tell me that I lived in an apartment. Surely if I'd screamed, someone would have heard and come to help. Surely there was something heavy enough in my closet to use to defend myself. Hell, even the laptop I had would hurt if I swung it at someone. Why didn't I do anything? I don't really have an answer for that. But the closet door, miraculously, held. I heard frustrated footsteps go back out into the living area of my apartment. I heard things breaking, bottles shattering, my drawers and refrigerator and cabinets being flung open as things were torn out of them. I continued to sit in that closet, silently crying, wanting to leave but feeling that death was inevitable. I feel awful about my selfishness in that moment, but I messaged my mom, who lived a 15 hours drive away, and told her what was happening. I desperately wanted comfort, and to tell her how much I love her. I'm not a parent, but I can only imagine the fear and helplessness I put her through, knowing her daughter was in danger and there was nothing she could do to help. She messaged me constantly, begging me to keep replying. I told her I would as long as I could, but I also told her to tell my brothers I loved them, to help my husband through whatever happened next if it ended badly for me. The intruder started messing with the closet door again, mumbling disjointed words that I couldn't really distinguish. I remember hoping that the police would get to the apartment before my husband, that he wouldn't be the one to find me in whatever state this invader left me in. The front door opened again, and it was my husband, shouting for me. The intruder walked out toward the living room/kitchen area again, where my front door was located, and I opened the door and darted from the closet to find my husband on the ground with him, pinning him in place. The man kept mumbling, at times yelling, but never really put up much resistance. This entire part is a blur for me. I remember feeling like the room was spinning, filled with fear mostly for my husband at this point. Eventually, the police found the apartment. It took them about 25 minutes to arrive, which still blows my mind. I know time seems to move slowly during scary situations, so I thought it was less than that. But from the time my husband dialed 911 to the time officers arrived, it was 25 excruciating minutes. This isn't intended to bash them in any way. It just always seemed like this was an unusually long response time for a home invasion. They got my things back from the man and took him out of my apartment. I numbly went through the process of filing a police report, telling them what happened. One of the officers commented that I should really keep my door locked at all times. I remember feeling like he was being insensitive at the time, or blaming me for what happened, but later recognized his words were coming from experience. I'm sure he's seen this situation end differently for other women. Within 30 minutes, the scariest incident of my life was over. But I've carried the fear, the violation, the anxiety of having someone intrude into my space for years. If it happened to me once, it could happen again. If you've made it this far, thanks for listening. Please consider continuing, because this isn't all doom and gloom. If this or something similar has happened to you, and you're still struggling with the aftermath of it, the sleepless nights, the laying awake listening for sounds of forced entry, the nightmares, the constant checking and rechecking your locks, this is what eventually helped me. A year after this took place, my husband and I moved to the Midwest for his job. We selected a safe town with a nice apartment complex and chose a third-floor apartment with only one point of entry. I looked up every statistic on crime for the neighborhood, finding that an isolated incidence of car theft was the only thing reported in decades. I still couldn't sleep at night. It was definitely better than staying in the same apartment in Memphis. But my husband often works night shifts now, and I simply couldn't continue being terrified to sleep at night. I realized my biggest fear wasn't that something could happen again, but that if it did, I was just as unprepared now as I was then. I hadn't changed anything other than locking my door, and I knew I would likely freeze up again and leave my life up to being able to hide well enough, or having a door hold long enough to save me, and that was unacceptable. I walked into a martial arts school with an excellent self-defense program, introduced myself, and started talking classes. At first I was quiet, hiding in the back of the room and generally keeping to myself. My instructor, who is both incredibly kind and incredibly insightful, slowly built up my confidence and brought me out of my bubble of fear. After several months of training, I finally shared my reason for taking classes with him, and he's worked with me tirelessly to give me the ability to protect myself in any environment. I've been training for years now, and the difference it has made in every aspect of my life is unbelievable. The meek, quiet girl that waited to die in her closest doesn't exist. I am confident. I am strong. I am worthy of living and protecting myself in my home. I no longer am ashamed of how I handled the situation I was in, but I also understand what steps I can take to ensure that I'm safe. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but it was worth it. I recognize this might not be a solution or option for everyone. Your experience is valid, and however you decide to cope with your own story is the right choice for you. This is how I happen to do it, and it's worked well for me. Thank you again for listening. I'm a little afraid to share this because I'm not sure how people will respond, but maybe doing so will help someone else that's feeling alone with this. If anyone is struggling with their own story and wants a kind ear to listen, I'm here. 2. I was in bed asleep at 7 a.m. when I heard a loud bang. I thought nothing of it because of the large cat tree I have downstairs that's always getting knocked over, so I rolled over and tried to go back to sleep. Not long after, my elderly cat comes running into my bedroom, jumps up on the bed, and tries to hide under the blankets. This immediately woke me up, because that old fat cat hadn't ran nor jumped on our bed for years. As I came to, I see 2 men coming up my stairs. At that point, it felt like time stopped and somehow ran incredibly fast at the same time. I jumped out of bed and started screaming, "Get the fuck out of my house!" And I remembered thinking, while chasing these guys through my house and screaming again and again at the top of my lungs, that my voice sounds exactly like my brother, and I wondered how strange that was. I tackled one of them on my front lawn, but he struggled free and got away. I saw the getaway car and tried to keep repeating the license number, but it faded away in my mind as I was repeating it. I remember vividly being so mad at myself that I couldn't remember 7 numbers, and how stupid I was for not grabbing my phone. Looking back on the situation, there are so many things that happened that I never noticed, like how I fractured my arm slamming into the wall at the bottom of my stairs, and that I cut my feet up on the splintered wood of my front door. The adrenaline rush of a true fight or flight situation is something so strange it's almost impossible to accurately describe. The sense of time, not being aware of pain and injuries for hours, and the hyper-focus on some details but the complete loss of others. Luckily, I wasn't seriously hurt and nothing was stolen, but I installed cameras all over my house the very next day. 3. My boyfriend Jay and I were staying with two friends of his, Jim and Jeremy. Jeremy had left the apartment an hour or so before Jay and I decided to go to bed. A few minutes after Jay fell asleep, I heard a knock on the door and Jim answered it. Turns out it was Jeremy, but he wasn't alone. Two guys that also lived in the apartment building forced Jeremy to knock at the door so that they could force their way in, as he didn't have his keys with him. Once they were inside, I could hear what sounded like a scuffle from where I was in the bedroom with the door closed. I woke Jay up and all of a sudden we hear two unknown voices yelling, "Get down, get the fuck on the ground." Jay wanted to go see what was going on, but I begged him to stay in the bedroom with me, which he did. After what seemed like a couple minutes of arguing and fighting sounds, everything went absolutely silent. We opened the bedroom door to see Jim laying on the ground with what we later found out to be a barbed machete sticking out of his chest. Jeremy was calling 911. The apartment building didn't have a buzzer to let anyone into the building, so when the police got there, Jay let them in and showed them to the suite we were in. After that, they separated us all and put the three of us into the back of 3 different police cars, where they left us while the paramedics tried to save Jim. Unfortunately, they weren't able to save him. He died at the apartment. I knew he was dead when the paramedics wheeled him out to the ambulance, but didn't leave for at least 5 minutes without working on him at all. The police took us to be questioned, again keeping us separated the entire time. About 12 hours later, they were ready to let us go, but told us we were not allowed to go back to the apartment as it was an active crime scene. We were dropped off by the police at a coffee shop with no money, phones, wallets, or even shoes on our feet, as they wouldn't let us take anything from the apartment before they put us in the police cars before being questioned. We ended up going to a friend's house where we stayed until we were let back into the apartment 4 or 5 days later. Once we were finally allowed back into the apartment, the first thing I had to do was clean up the blood, which I'm sure you can imagine was pretty hard to handle. It was pretty traumatic. 4. Couple weeks before my 19th birthday, I woke about one morning around 4 a.m. while someone was trying to break my bedroom door down. I had fallen asleep with my light on after coming in tired from work, so when they came in my room, I could at least see what was happening. Not that it helped much at first. There were 2 guys and one of them immediately attacked me with a hammer, so I told them to just take whatever they wanted. The other guy started to load all my electronics into a backpack. Meanwhile, my mother down the hall had woken up with the commotion and started shouting to know what's going on. Staying in her room at least. Next moment, they both ran out my room and shut the door on the way out, going to my mother's room. She managed to hold the door closed on them for a few seconds, giving me time to open the safe in my cupboard, 6-digit key code that I amazingly input correctly the first time, and remove my pistol. I checked for a round in the chamber and went to open the door to make my way to my mother's room. As I opened the door, one of the guys turned around and ran at me with a hammer. I fired 2 shots before he could get to me and push me back in to my room and onto my bed, where he held me down and tried to take my pistol, while the other guy started to cut my arm and head with what turned out to be one of my mother's own kitchen knives. My mother eventually joined the fray and managed to take the knife away from the guy cutting me. Meanwhile, I was just holding onto the pistol with everything I had in me, because I knew that if one of them got control of the firearm, my mother and I would be dead. My mother froze after she took the knife away, and the guy got up, grabbing my DVD player, and knocked my TV to the ground, then hit me over my head with the DVD player. By this time, I managed to sort of wrestle my gun hand free and shouted to my mother to get out of the way for me to try and get off another shot. She rolled off of the bed, and I managed to turn the gun enough to get a shot off in to the guy on top of me. It was then that they decided to bolt and grabbed my bag of electronics on the way out. When the cops came, they found a body with 2 gunshot wounds in my garden a few meters away from the house, and a blood trail leading away where it disappeared at a nearby road. 5. In my case, I'm kind of the neighborhood mom. I have my own kids and have a nice backyard with a swimming pool, and I always have the good snacks. I live in a neighborhood that is mixed social class, with some folks that are upper middle class a few streets up from me, and some folks in Section 8 a few streets down. I make up the border of in between. I'd say we're lower middle class, not the poorest of poor, and we can cover a few minor car or appliance repairs where needed, but we'd probably be screwed if a big cash-requiring emergency happened. Sometimes the poorer neighborhood kids come over to swim in our Walmart pop-up pool. Sometimes they knock on our door and ask for snacks. Sometimes I notice their shoes are too small or falling apart, and I pick up a pair of shoes that might fit them better. One day, a few years ago, During the height of the George Floyd protests, 3 boys, 6, 8, and 15, started coming to my door every morning for breakfast. They'd play with my kids all day, eating lunch and dinner, playing in the pool, watching cartoons, and just hanging out. Then at night, they'd grudgingly leave. They never answered questions about their parents, and their parents never seemed to look for them or wonder where they were. They were always wearing the same clothes and swam in their underwear, and honestly, they smelled pretty awful. I bought them some new clothes and some soap and shampoo suitable for their hair and skin and sent them up to shower and change one day. They then told me that their dad was an alcoholic and beat them and threw them out. I let them spend the night, and the next day I called a social worker friend of mine, and we took them to a local youth shelter. Their dad pitched a fit, and they were forced to come home, but then they were immediately thrown out again. They came back to my house, and I let them sleep here again. They started sneaking over every night their dad threw them out. One day, they ran to my house and banged on my door. I threw it open and was met with 3 bloodied kids. The 15-year-old had a head injury and a black eye and 2 broken fingers. One of the younger boys had a huge cut on his cheek and a bruise on his side, and the other had bruises all up and down his back. I brought them inside and locked the door. We called the police. They took 5.5 hours to respond. I sent the boys upstairs to the bathroom with my kids and told them to hide. I called my friends. For 5.5 hours, the boy's drunken, armed father tried to kick in my solid oak door. He screamed at my neighbors, calling me a pedophile. Thankfully, no one believed him. And eventually, he split the door, just as the police showed up. I stood there in my living room watching the door with my boss staff while my friends stood outside waiting and watching to make sure things were safe. I prayed to my grandmother's gods that I wouldn't have to use my staff, and prepared myself to try and calmly talk him down, but to do whatever I had to do to keep him from getting at the kids. He did manage to break my door, but the deadbolt and the latch lock thing held, so he didn't make it all the way inside. The police didn't arrest him though,